We're into week 10 already. I don't know if you guys are as surprised about that as I am, but here we are. We have a wonderful guest speaker today, but before we get into that, I just want to begin with, of course, our acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country. We also acknowledge the significant contribution they have and continue to make in caring for this land and sharing their knowledge and culture with us. We acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are also joining us today, either in person or online as well. Before we begin, I also just wanted to do a quick congratulations and mention some research success that we've had within our school recently. So we had some wonderful funding success to mention. Professor Tegan Crewis received an NHMRC Level 1 Investigator Grant. Congratulations. And this is on effective community solutions to prevent and treat loneliness. Professor Christine Phillips and colleagues also received an NHMRC MRFF TCR award for enhancing safe telehealth for all in high-risk consultations, a multi-perspective mixed methods study. And we had several psychology honors students who were awarded research scholarships from the Australian Signals Directorate and ANU CoLab, including Nadia Andrews, Henry Costello, Maya Felice, Sophia Hajimichael, and Rachel Newen. So congratulations to everybody. It's wonderful to see some great success is happening towards the end of this semester. Okay, without further ado, I will introduce our current speaker today. As I mentioned, he is a guest speaker from UNSW, Professor Zachary Steel. Thanks for joining us. The title of his presentation will be Rethinking Evidence-Based Medicine and Mental Health, Transitioning to Evidence-Based Care. And Professor Steel holds the St. John of God Chair of Trauma and Mental Health, a partnership between Richmond Hospital and the UNS School of Clinical Medicine. With over 3 decades of clinical and research expertise, he focuses on trauma-impacted populations, including veterans, emergency service workers, refugees, and asylum seekers. Professor Steel is the past president of the Australasian Society for Traumatic Stress Studies and past member of the Department of Veteran Affairs Clinical Reference Committee. He currently serves on the Board of Service for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors and Integra Service Dogs Australia, a national agency based in Canberra, placing assistance animals with injured veterans and first responders. I'll just get Zach's presentation up and ready, and we'll be set. Okay, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you.
Please welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. It's love to be here. David Bell and I worked together for quite a few years out at Richmond Hospital. David was with me at UNSW and then took up a role at UTS, and we've lost him to you. So, but I just see it as my way to take over. I've always, in my career, I've always had these sort of mixed roles of sort of clinical and academic appointments, which have been great. And my current role sort of probably involves about a 0.4, 0.5 clinical work at a number of hospitals, our Burwood and our Richmond hospitals. And this is a picture of the, just wonderful hospital I get to work out at North Richmond. This is a grand old building called Belmont House. And it was actually built as an anniversary present for the wife of the founder of BHP. So it's hard to beat that, really, isn't it? The land that we're on is direct country in Sydney, but it's actually quite a remarkable place because at the very beginning of Australian settlement, invasion, colonization, this was really one of the very first frontiers for a battle between the local Darug people and the early settlers, they'd been planting yam all up and down the Hawkesbury River. I think there's a book called The Secret River written about this, if any of you've ever read that. And they all got torn up for production of maize. And then the local Darug people, that was one of the major food staples. So they started to take the maize as an alternative. And of course, none of it was understood. They took giant cultural misunderstanding. And so they led to the Battle of Richmond Hill. So we've got this memorial site on our hospital, that probably is one of the very first, terrible incidents or events that happened. But it's, it's really a massacre site at one level, because the disproportionality of the weapons involved. But the Darug people had sort of always talked about that as a bit of a sacred retreat place for healing. So just this story of the hospital is one of, a land that has such terrible pain behind it, but is now, a therapeutic space for people with trauma to come to. So we've got a 30-bed PTSD ward and a sort of big outpatient program. When the PTSD was finally recognised amongst the Vietnam veterans, it sort of happened at the same time that all of the national repat hospitals were decommissioned. So it suddenly moved to the private sector, and our hospital was one of the first hospitals that started to provide evidence-based treatments for those veterans. And then we've continued. We now work with still currently serving and ex-serving defence personnel, but also a lot of first responders, police, fire and rescue, paramedics, and a lot of other frontline workers. So, railway drivers who encounter quite a bit of trauma. It turns out disability workers, accident response groups, people working in prisons, things like that. And so a lot of people come to us. Well, really almost all people that come into us are funded either through DVA or work cover effectively. So this makes a very interesting kind of complex problem, because they're sort of simultaneously trying to get worldwide battling for their entitlements. So it creates this kind of mutually unraveling forces, as they try to get, providing care in that space is very complicated. So,
just might click with the mouse on the screen and then
okay, thank you. It all worked before, didn't it?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
There we go. So that's a little bit of that background. There we've just managed to do a fairly big redevelopment, which is hard to do in this time. So it gives I suppose, a vibrancy to our service, hopefully for another 30 to 50 years. At the moment, we're sort of in an era where there's this big transition occurring. A lot of the workplace injuries that we've seen historically were all musculoskeletal, accidental falls and, accidental death. And there's been such reform in the workplace health and safety that the proportion of injury associated with those things has gone down substantially. But mental health and psychological injuries are the only injury form that's sort of consistently going up over time. So at the moment, if you just take all sort of injuries in the workplace across all groups, coming on 9.2, but coming up to 10% of all injuries are now psychological. And that's substantially, that's sort of a fairly large increase, about 43% over the last 10 years. And this sort of shows you, that just sort of shows you what that proportion looks like. we're still getting a lot of those repetitive strain injuries and things like that as fairly frequent and common, low back pain, things like that. But it is the second leading, you can see it's the second leading workplace mental health injury category now. And this is just the way that it has grown over time. So, that's the growth in psychological injuries occurring in the workplace. And you can see at least, there was a big drop as, workplace health and safety legislation came in and a plateauing out with sort of the effectiveness of the risk man systems. And the thing about these, which we'll look at in a second, is that they don't really respond so well and then very hard to mitigate. And probably Australia is in one of the biggest experiments occupationally that's ever occurred, because just in the middle of last year, all industry became subject to having to treat psychosocial hazards in the workplace as a workplace safety issue. But it's not just, it puts a positive obligation on the employer to identify and eliminate psychosocial hazards. And if you look at the psychosocial hazards, anybody who's working will say, I have most of those in my day. But it's no longer acceptable for workplaces to say, oh, we didn't know about it. So they've got a positive obligation to inquire, investigate, and ensure the absence of psychosocial hazards. And this has come about because the global proportion of injury attributed to mental health related things is rapidly increasing. And in fact, it's a group from Griffith that have done a lot of the foundational research that has led to the ISO standards that have gone global, in fact. It's funny, I've got some former students at the UN, and I just happened to have a chance to catch up with them, and the UN has exempted itself from the standards, saying they're too hard to implement for the agency. So, hang on, yes. So probably what's not showing there is just the duration. I think the average duration of a normal injury off work is about 7 weeks, and the average duration of a psychological injury is 34 weeks. The average payout is about 5 times higher than a physical injury, and the return to work rates are much lower. So we don't know how to address psychologically hazardous workplaces, or how to help people recover. And at the most extreme level, if you sort of take, so this is the kind of the model that, is put into place to try to address it. It's a kind of a managed care model, where you've got presumably a beneficent case officer who's trying to direct you through to healthcare, but it's micromanaged. Each of the things are often disputed. Has anybody here been in a workplace health and that had to go through and put a workplace injury claim in for anything? They're not much fun. Many a doctor will advise you, no, don't do that, because, the stress involved in it and the disputation involved in it, you have to be extraordinarily resilient. But then you get that group of people that, are very severely injured, and then you've got this system that is built to protect people. It's designed to ensure, because without it, when we didn't have, a worker, industry could just, leave somebody disabled and just say, well, we're sacking you now, you can't do your job. That's it. So once that there was a duty of care and a responsibility to support, then there's been this very long kind of battle between trying to meet that obligation and minimize exposure to it. So, so we see, it's either through something like Department of Veterans Affairs, or it's through some insurer that is responsible for managing the injury and ensuring that you get access to the care, and to work out the level of disability you have. And it's a very complicated system. You have to get a certain level of points, and at each level of points depends on how much salary supplementation you will get. If you get over 22 points, you're treated as total and permanent impairment. But they can discount you for, let's just say you've had a period in your life where you were sad. Well, that'll be a 10% discount. So you can get a point, 22 points or 23 points, you get a 10% discount, you come down to below the threshold, and you then just get a lower payout. And it's all driven by independent medical examination reports. So it's a very fraught and complex system. We're operating in that space. And then we're operating in a space where there's been just a kind of a sudden change in how we think about things. So, PTSD was a very standard diagnosis, formally introduced in 1980 into DSM, has a very long history. There's an incredible account by Sigmund Freud of PTSD, of German World War I veterans returning. You could just read it as a current report, like it is phenomenal, just things like that their dreams aren't like, because he's a psychoanalyst, right? So he interpreted dreams. To say their dreams resist all analysis. It's like they're fused in time to that place, forced to relive their most terrible moment over and over and over with no insight. That's PTSD. He just captured it extraordinarily well. It's also a disorder that has just been a hot potato. So in World War I, shell shock. And then it was just not talked about for, how long can I talk for?
45.
Okay, right. Can you give me a 10-minute warning?
You got it.
That way I'll get through the last 90% of my slides.
You got 25 minutes left.
Yeah. And then after World War II, it was considered that it was actually abandoned completely from the diagnostic system. So when the Vietnam veterans came back to the US and to Australia, our repatriation authority said, any mental health condition you've got now is due to your own, poor management of your life. If it happened over there, we're responsible, but back here. So for 10 years, they just were denied any access to any care. And this is what led to such a global movement. Well, an Anglophone movement to get it into the diagnostic system. But it has a very long history. If any of you, there's a book called 12 Years a Slave that they made into a movie. If you read that book, it's a shocking description of PTSD in that. And that's from the, mid-1800s. So you can just see it is, and of course there's the Greek, tragedies and things where you see accounts of it. It seems to be a fundamental component of human experience, these features. I work a lot cross-culturally, and why things may change in their cultural manifestation. The intrusive, highly hypervigilant is universal in populations, even though it might have a cultural pathoplasticity in its meaning and expression. But all of a sudden, some fairly convincing research has emerged to say, well, actually, it probably splits into two groups. I started work just with a psychiatrist who worked with refugees. So my very early work was with the Service for Torture and Trauma Survivors. And so right from the beginning, you know, PTSD doesn't come anywhere near to capture the kind of shattered lives that come from torture. So you sort of know that there was something more needed, and it just took an enormous long time of research. There were quite a few attempts to get it up into the diagnostic system. There was, it's all before your time, but there was an attempt to get something up called DESNOS, disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified. It just couldn't hang together. Marilyn Cloyter and a whole group of researchers, they finally sort of codified this syndrome and identified this thing called disturbances in self-organization that seems to capture what you get with people who are more profoundly impacted by trauma. And this is, you know, those groups, torture survivors, people coming through hostage situations, people surviving extraordinary, you know, long-term abusive relationships, you know, as children or as partners, you know, horrendous situations of prolonged, repeated, severe trauma is what it's meant to capture. And it's got everything that PTSD has, and then it goes to a higher level. It leads to a kind of, it has some features similar to borderline personality in that there's very poor distress regulation, distress tolerance, sort of a unraveling of the integration of the self, and interpersonal relationships become highly fractious. And you see it so consistently across people with more severe trauma. Now, what surprised everybody, and this is the measure this is probably the simplest measure to capture it. And it's tied into ICD-11. We don't know what DSM-6 will do, but there's you know, pretty solid evidence of this bimodal distribution in PTSD. You get really good discrimination in latent class analyses, like really, and consistently repeated. So now, so this had significance to us. It's not meant to, because it wasn't really just meant to be thought about to be relevant to, say, veterans or first responders. They weren't in scope when it was thought about. We've been running this thing called the Richmond Hospital Trauma Recovery Program for about 30 years. It was the first intensive, prolonged exposure, you know, treatment program in a private psychiatric hospital in the country. And now it's led to them being all over. And this was that first study, which I've just highlighted down there, which is from 1999, was our first sort of evaluation of that. So the way we run it effectively is a 4-week massed prolonged exposure activity on the hospital. So we've got, we bring people into a residential situation, not admitted as patients, but at residential, and then we do intensive trauma exposure work with them to get them through that process. There's meant to be so what we found, to our surprise, is that when we looked at the people coming through, 97% of them met diagnostic criteria in this new thing for complex PTSD. They weren't in scope for this thing. And then it sort of leads to a kind of realization that it's got, the way it had been thought about probably originally was a perpetrator and a victim. And actually it's just about trauma load. It's, if you can be the person who's in control and in mastery, but if you're exposed to continuous trauma, it is the amount of trauma excitation that seems to be critical to whether, when you get unwell, this develops. Then we looked at it in Australia again. This is in the sort of PTSD field. Phoenix, Australia, down in Melbourne, are sort of the peak body. So while we were publishing our ones, they published a national one of the same thing and did the same thing around CPTSD. So around CPTSD, they found, again, just looking at veterans at all of the hospitals attending these programs. So now most of ours come through inpatients to get there. A lot of for some of the others, it's just a direct admission. So there's a lower, not as higher acuity. But you can see still, close to 80% of them have this complex PTSD. And the main thing about it is that when they turn up, they're more severe. They've got much more severe symptoms, and they're the poor relationships and just poor quality of life. So they're much more unwell. Then another thing has blown up in us, moral injury. Have you heard of that term, moral injury? We don't know what it is. It doesn't, you can't look in any diagnostic system and find moral injury. We haven't used that term moral for ages. We can thank Dick Cheney for it, really, because, the rules of protection that, maybe were never there really anyway around military just got eroded. And all of a sudden, they just saw huge levels of, American military personnel having an injury when their life was never in any way under danger. It didn't meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but they were more severely disturbed and distressed at what they'd witnessed. And this had been described previously with the Vietnam veterans, but from a different angle. For them, it was betrayal. They came back, they were shamed, they were rejected by the community, they were rejected by the VA. For this other group, they came back more with, guilt on their hands that they're breaching in their own personal ethics of the way they should behave. And so it was more around moral injury of perpetration rather than of being victimized. And so that's led to this surge of interest in moral injury. And actually, I can thank David for this because he found this instrument for us and we started to use this moral injury event scale. We adapted it to both veterans and first responders. And then we just wanted to see, this is our inpatient ward. Now, this is a phenomenal finding, and I'm just working on adding an extra couple of years to this. It's just about 103 people, and I know that's hard to see. So this is the battery of measures that we try to use on people coming into our hospital. So hang on, I'll get this thing working. So we use for anxiety the GAD and the PHQ. This is in addition to like psychiatric proper psychiatric evaluation, but this is more for care planning. Then these are the different domains of PTSD, so intrusion, avoidance, mood, and arousal. And then this is that DSO, disorders of extreme stress. That's distress, tolerance. That's the self integration. That's interpersonal attachments. And it's very good around disassociation too. And so use that. Then we measure for anger, sleep, insomnia, chronic pain, alcohol use disorders. And then these are the 4 constructs: witnessing, morally egregious or, potentially morally injurious events, committing potentially morally injurious events, failing to prevent morally injurious events, and feeling betrayed, by those who should protect you. So now the first thing we discovered is that a whole ward is stratified by moral injury. So if you look at this very top one, this is our most severe group, and that counts for, in this case, about 1 in 5. This is the people who committed moral injury. So they're the ones that have at least conscious to know, they haven't had moral degradation when they think I haven't done anything wrong, so they've still got that kind of moral system intact. And we've found that group, it's very hard to work with that group because if they get well, they're letting themselves off the hook. So you've got this kind of treatment, invalidating cognitive beliefs that are just a part of that. If anybody, these are the narratives that you hear. If anybody knows what I did, they'd never talk to me again. There's just no way I can ever rejoin society, or if I get well, I can't get well because I don't deserve it. Then you've got this other big group that we're working with, and these are the people who are betrayed, by their organisations. And this group, there's a different set of cognitive structures in there. It is, I'm not going to get well because it lets those bastards off the hook. Like, they've got to pay. So they're in this titanic battle. So that's half of the people we work with. So walking into some challenges, right? Then we've got this standard PTSD group, but you can see, again, so everybody working in these types of work witness morally egregious events. And they've got sort of a mid-range on all of these things. And that group, actually, we know responds very well to treatment. And then we've got this other group that just appeared in our ward that we didn't even realize were there. They're just baffled, not even particularly symptomatic. Low symptoms, but moral injury has just made, I really don't know how to get back to life. So it's just interesting. And then they'll often get a diagnosis of adjustment disorder. So now this is the cohort that this injury management system is trying to care for. So you can see all sorts of challenges that are likely to emerge. These are some guidelines that have been developed. There's the National Best Practice Guidelines. They're very well evidence-based. They outline all of their core treatments. We still don't know how to treat complex PTSD. It responds extraordinarily well to prolonged exposure therapy, but it doesn't get them anywhere near well. And we found in our program, because it's residential, that if we don't give them training in distress tolerance first, it's like putting a pack of dogs together. They don't get through the program, because there's too much friction between them. So we have to do a phase-based approach just to create psychological safety. So you do see this recognition that, there are times when phase-based approaches might be suitable. So that's where you structure intervention to follow a sequence. And that's where you'd start with something. And I'll show you what we do start with. Now, this is just a bit of a sample from the guidelines. One of the things I just want, this is for military personnel. And this is one of the complexities. In view of the poorer treatment outcomes for those with military PTSD, modifications to standard treatments may be needed in clinical practice to individualize treatment and specific presentation. We don't know what that is. Nobody knows what that is. But we don't get good outcomes. You don't get good return to work outcomes. I was just meeting with one of the peak bodies yesterday, and they were sort of bagging out one of our competitors, saying, oh, once we get to them, we don't get any good return to work outcomes. And I sort of didn't have the heart to break to them, well, it's the same here. Once they get to this level of unwellness, it's very hard to turn around. But they attributed it to a therapeutic failure rather than being curious as to why. There's this sort of recognition of this problem. So they've come to us, hoping to solve it. So I was trying to let them down gently and saying, well, we do try this, but, we need to work with big data to get a good outcome. And I'll come back to what I mean by that. So we've got all these off-the-shelf evidence-based treatments that aren't working. They're not working so well. This is just some others that are in there that I won't take you through too much detail. Trying to get on top of this because I just happened to, when my son was 5, he became good friends with another 5-year-old, and the dad was managing the insurance for one of these big first responder organizations. And he said, oh, yeah, you know, it's about 5% financially of my portfolio, and it's about 90% of my time because of the complexity. Like, they can't get positive outcomes. And what they do is get highly angered, aggrieved, embittered, injured workers screaming at their staff. And it just sort of spirals down out of control. And then there's all these comorbidities that sit there, you know, and if you sequence these things, you see like, you know, substance abuse comes on about 2 years after the onset of the injury because they tough it out, but then, oh my God, I just need a drink. And then it takes off from there. So you just get all these comorbidities that just start to sit in. And because of the nature of trauma, it's so common that they've got chronic pain. And that's a complex condition to treat as well. And mainly you need a multidisciplinary team and not opiates. So, you know, we've recognized we need to take a holistic approach. So we work very intimately with exercise physiologists. We carried out one of the first clinical trials in our hospital around exercise for PTSD, and the effect size is about the same as you get from medication. You know, just getting people active, and there's sort of all-cause increase in mortality for most mental health conditions because people become sedentary. And, you know, as psychologists, we are the worst offenders of thinking that people are a mind and not a body. And if the body, you know, so integrating or working collaboratively with a group like an exercise physiologist can give such good improvements in mental health, more than just pleasant activity scheduling. Because then you get overall health benefits too, you know, reduce all the non-communicable lifestyle, a whole lot of lifestyle risk factors to morbidity and mortality get addressed. This was a pathway to care that we once had. I won't take you through that, but basically the way it's funded, right? The way the health system is funded is it's transactional. We deliver a package of care. Hello, goodbye. There's no relationship forged. There's a relationship forged in this bit of time. The money's highly allocated in different bits, and nobody is looking at the journey. Nobody. The insurer is trying to get an outcome. They won't refer to anybody. It's just, you know, it is and you can give a really good package of care. Like we've had situations where we've got somebody really well, and then there's a decision from DVA that says, oh, we've rejected this claim, and then we've got them on suicide watch, you know, just as they graduate from our program. You know, like the system constantly undermines itself. Okay. So that's the measure we're doing. I'm going to skip through our treatment. One of the things that we do a lot of now is this isn't, you know, because all we would have in the past is DBT, because DBT's got those, you know, modules for, you know, distress tolerance, you know, interpersonal effectiveness. I should remember that. It's been a while since I've run the DBT program. You know, but you know, it's a 12-month program. So what we were doing for the people with low DS, I always put them through the introduction to DBT. But this program's been invented more as a more condensed way to give skills when a person isn't completely dysregulated, like needing a full DBT program. And we find that it often gives a lot of foundational skills, so then people go on and do trauma work. So we've started to try to create pathways of care. So I'm just going to take you through some data. Oh, that's our model. That one of our that's our treatment mascot that we introduce everybody to. And this was federal police officer. We were just talking one day in one of the trauma recovery programs, and just using the metaphor of it's like being on a snakes and ladders board. And it is so frustrating when you make all this progress and you hit a snake and you go back. And you can lose hope and motivation and things like that. And of course, the moral to the story is that actually, if you do keep rolling the dice, you do get off the board. You might be the first off the board. The only reason you stay on the board is you give up. So that's the take-home message. Anyhow, after that, they went and painted this. And so it's become our mascot, our treatment mascot, to try to help people navigate the complex care system they're entering into. So, so we discovered a couple of things to begin with. I'll start off with us. So the first thing that we introduced this measure for complex PTSD, and this is what we found. If you just stratified all of our people going through our treatment program by DSO, this group here, which I don't have the numbers here, but it was roughly about a third, they basically almost remitted. And they were low on DSO. But then we found the two higher ones, they were too dysregulated to benefit from the treatment. Then a bigger analysis, a bigger analysis was carried out around all people going through these programs. Oh, this is the first bit. This is latent class analysis, not using DSO, but a latent class analysis looking at the different groups of recovery. This one group here that's massive is, very small in the total population. What we're getting is, a lot of people. So you're getting about, 1/3 showing a fairly substantial gain, but again, nowhere near well. So they're getting a clinical benefit, but the endpoint is not well. You're getting some people just not moving at all, really. So overall, if you summarize all that, like 1/3 of people are sort of recovering to a point where they've got a functional life in front of them. 1/3 are getting huge treatment gains, but are still highly functionally disabled. And another group just it's not even touching them. So how do you feel about that as the treatment outcome, the best we can do? It's not very encouraging, is it? The best, and these are sort of people that have given 30 years to serve their country, and this is the best we can offer them. So it's pretty concerning. That's our experience. And then this is all the national data on CPTSD. Here at least they show this parallelism, but again, the people with CPTSD. Okay, you're giving them a benefit, but they're not being able to do anything after that. It's not taking them back to well. You're getting a clinical gain, and that's really good. But, what about an outcome of functional, being able to, return to work is, it's a notion about being able to re-enter and re-engage in some form of activity, gainfully. And you can take broader or narrow definitions of it. So we've just got some real challenges. We've tried this new approach, which is a pathways approach. And we're still extracting the data. I would have loved to have had a lot more data for you. So this is tracking people over 18 months. And this is where we're trying to engage people. So we're trying to build recovery. We're trying to deliver evidence-based treatments in a sequence to address where they are at the end. So this is that group of moral injury, that group that I showed you at the beginning with moral injury, where half of them don't even want to get well. So we only managed to get 33 of them into treatment. afterwards. And what this sort of showed is this real resistance and stability of symptoms across a treatment journey. And then we got a substantial improvement at the end. It was almost like, you know, if you stay engaged for long enough, you start to see the turnaround. Now, this is still very descriptive data, and that's going across multiple programs. So that's starting from the inpatient, and sometimes, you know, they had 2 inpatient admissions, and then they went through a number of different programs at our day program centre, and then finally they went through, generally the last program was the trauma recovery program, but sometimes it was a DBT program. And then we see a sudden gain. So there's something about a care journey that is more important to think about than a treatment, an individual treatment. So I'm going to sort of finish on this point. At the moment, we've got ourselves into a terrible predicament. And the predicament is I suppose it's a commodity, you know, we're presenting our treatments as commodities that can be delivered as widgets in a disconnected way without keeping an overall vision on the healing journey of a person over time. So these big funding agencies, they have a duty to ensure that people are giving evidence-based treatment, but zero duty to ensure that they get to it. They won't fund other things, but that they get to it, or that it occurs in a sequence where all things work together. And there's no accountability around, you know, how many IMEs, independent medical exams, people are sent to, even though there's so much evidence around the iatrogenesis of parts of that. So how do you fix, you know, we've got the Royal Commission just about to hand down its results here. There's surging suicide rates. Because what, you know, with that kind of moral injury presentation and the accumulation across time, it's not surprising that you're getting surging suicide rates. They often come against a, you know, after a negative decision or a negative outcome. But often the decision-making is totally, it's administrative decision-making. It's totally divorced from any care package. And in the first responder populations, there's no national register that we're doing it, but you talk to anybody that works in emergency services and they'll always talk about, you know, how many colleagues have taken their lives, ex-colleagues and things like that. So there's this like, you know, really worrying thing that's going on. And the bills are surging because it turns out that we're not just, you know, we need coherence as individuals in a care journey, but the models of funding we've built aren't there. So the last challenge, and this is the challenge that we as psychologists don't think about, is how do you create systemic change? We usually just, there's so many dangers to us as psychologists. You know, they were employing a lot of young psychologists and dumping them in on those, you know, Christmas Island, Manus Island, Nauru, on 6-week rotations, great salaries, but then you'd be sent in to like break up hunger strikes. And when they did exit interviews with people coming off those things, they say, who are you most angry with? They're those fucking psychologists. Because befriended me and betrayed me. So systemic issues are really important, you know, and so we've realized ourselves as an institution, we're delivering these packages of care, but we're not getting the outcomes we want, or they're just being undermined. So we know we need to bring an implementation science framework to this kind of approach. You know, there's all kinds of attempts now to start to use big data to monitor well-being, to start to use complex Bayesian and modeling to see, can we identify people on deteriorating trajectory and create an evidence base? So at this point in time, a person with this score set, we can say to the practitioner, at this point in time, you get a better outcome if you do this. And then with continuous assessment. Now, both of DVA and the insurers are closed systems. So we're sort of hoping that we'll be able to get an opportunity to work with them using some of these things of data linkage, just to link up all of the, because they're paying for it all, so they can link it all. Create this notion of the learning healthcare system, have a great Bayesian model of just constantly looking for patterns of deterioration and patterns of progress, looking at events, sentinel events that are leading to an outcome. You know, we've got a lot of research now showing that every IME you go to, you get a decrement in your recovery. So they don't save money through this prudential thing to make sure people aren't, you know, cheating the system. They just make more disability. There's this incredible new thing that was invented in COVID, the adaptive platform trials. Have you heard of that? So, you know, because the state of the art is the RCT, right? You know, the randomized control trial. Well, when you had 90% of people getting onto ventilators in ICU dying, you couldn't wait for an RCT. So they put in this new type of technology, which isn't, it's integrated into healthcare delivery. And they're running 16 parallel clinical trials. You know, one of the famous ones, REPAT-CAT, which was won by a colleague that David and I both linked in with a little bit, Steve Webb. They identified about 5 drugs that are being used right around the world that were killing people. So stopped that. And the clinical trial stops as soon as the weight of evidence is that one thing's better than the others. And so that's just now becoming a routine part of care. It's no longer just getting lost in journals. It's making sure that implementation science occurs concurrently. And there's this thing called deliverology. It's a great term, but it came out of the Blair government, actually, and it came out of how do you get real change in education? And it applies well to health. You can't set a policy, you need to deliver it. You need a unit that is specifically designed to ensure that what we want to go into policy is delivered and measured the whole way. You know, and that's where that's a multidisciplinary group of people inside and outside that, you know, are separate from the agency without a conflict of interest with the one purpose to ensure the delivery of the program. So these are sort of some wonderful new developments to get real systemic change. So we need to move beyond clinical trials because clinical trials are irrelevant at one level to what's going to happen in the field in front of me. This is that scientist practitioner model, you know, but now we've got so much more substantive data behind us. It's just nobody's leveraging it. You know, the mental health data set, it is the, you know, if you have a look at the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, you'll see these wonderful reports. Nobody's doing analysis on that report to say, well, who's doing well and who's not doing. We've got all the data. So we've got to move to that next level of real-time use of data to inform clinical decision-making to better outcome, because the healthcare system's too complicated now. You have no power. The force is way beyond you unless we get everything working together. This is the challenge we've got. It's no longer about evidence-based treatment. Yeah. I think I'm out of time.
5 minutes for questions.
Great. Thank you.
I'll open to the floor here and online. If you're online, you can either raise your hand and then unmute yourself or pop your question in the chat.
So firstly, thank you for this presentation and also thank you for the work that you do. I was curious, with my limited knowledge of like CPTSD, I thought it was you had to kind of be reoccurring experiencing the trauma. So I was wondering how in your study with like 97%, I'm assuming there were veterans scoring. I wasn't like questioning it, but I was kind of wondering like why? Is it more like, you know, I know for example you said how like after the Vietnam War with the kind of societal reaction, like that would kind of make sense. But like, I want to know why.
So, I mean, they're very high scores on the PCL. So, you know, they've got constant re-experiencing symptoms and things like that. I suppose, you know, the thing about PTSD that you do get some spontaneous remission. But there's just really substantial evidence that unless you do something to reconsolidate that memory, if you continue patterns of avoidance, it plagues you with intrusions and nightmares for the rest of your life. I mean, it's very clear now, we know nightmares that, every night we consolidate our memory. It's just a package. And if you consolidate memory, being radiated up from the amygdala and the limbic system, it's a nightmare. That's just that's where nightmares get generated from. And it's trying to consolidate it every night, and it can't do it because you don't feel safe. So the systems that are designed to shut it down fail, because the threat, I mean, at the core of it, I mean, if you think, what does trauma processing do? Trauma processing is taking you back into the trauma so that you can develop a coherent framework to hold it. And you see we use the SUDS, the 0 to 10 SUDS rating scale. They'll be a 10 at the very first one, and they'll get back and they'll go, oh, my SUDS hasn't shifted now. And it's not because they're covert neutralizing all that. It's just not a problem anymore because it's consolidated. Kim Firmingham from Melbourne Uni did the very first study that showed, after you do, prolonged exposure therapy, the memory's distributed in the cortex. That's where you're accessing it. So you were accessing it before from the subcortical structures, and then it's fully accessed from there. It's not that it's moved, it's always there in the cortex. Because in the subcortical structures, if you're in danger, you see it become activated again, and it's hardwired into your, cortisol system. I mean, it's a brilliant system. It's so quick. It's, people, the first responder, they're like, if there's a threat in the hospital, like most of the time, they're the most incompetent, irritating, annoying people until there's an emergency. Then they're all brilliant, and we're just walking around like useless appendages because it's in their body. It's a set point tied to that. It just completely, and it's quicker than conscious thought. That's the core thing. So this system that we have inside of us, designed us to survive, is highly adaptive. It's, our conscious capacity to identify threat can never be as quick as this system. And I think that's why it's CPTSD, because they've just got that so calibrated from so many traumas that when it smashes, when they get injured and all those memories start to become unconsolidated and can't get reconsolidated, it just causes so much more disturbance in the emotional world. Yeah. That's why I think the victim status isn't important. It's the total quantity of trauma, which is the degree to which your own threat response system has become highly attuned to danger.
We have
Yeah.
time for one more.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your presentation. Really, really engaging. My question is really around the comorbidities point that you brought up.
Yeah.
So, in a previous life, I used to work in a injuries organization. And what we saw in that context was people who had experienced physical injuries related to work, but then the burden of psychological injuries that followed that was enormous. And I think for a lot of the reasons you were talking about, the workers' comp system can actually be very traumatic, that moral injury is often experienced in engaging with a system that basically blames you for your injury. And so people would become quite mentally unwell over time. And I guess I was curious about whether that might speak to that group you were talking about with the relatively low PTSD symptoms in your context. I mean, is that a pattern of unfolding injury that you see at all in your context? I guess that's my question.
So that's the group, they go through the system and they get the diagnosis of adjustment disorder, or sometimes, a smarter psychiatrist will give them atypical depression. If you haven't looked at, that diagnostic category is really interesting because it's depression without mood disturbance. So it's a really interesting category. It's all these other features. So, and that's where, they might have suffered bullying and things like that. It hasn't led to a complete collapse in the trauma. I mean, this is what I think has happened, is that they're not getting the same level of intrusions and things like that. Or they just don't have an event that can meet the category. But they're shattered by it. And I think we're still yet to fully answer who they are. I'm trying to update that data with another 3 years so that then the groups would be bigger, repeat that LCA, and then see how it does relate to long-term outcomes for those different groups. But that is the most interesting group. In looking at them, that group, it does seem to be this adjustment disorder group that, appear to be highly unwell, but don't fit any diagnostic stuff. Yeah.
Okay, we might leave it there. If you guys please assist me in thanking Professor Steel for coming. I'll just make a couple of remarks for closing. Next week, we have another guest speaker, Dr. Elise Stevenson from the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Next Friday is Idahabit, or International Day Against LGBTQIA+ discrimination. And in recognition of this day, Elise will be speaking to us about queer experiences in politics, leadership, and international representation. So we hope you can join us for that great talk. For those in person today, we've of course booked a table over at Badger under the School of Medicine and Psychology, or SMP. Unfortunately, Joe's not here and I actually have to run off to an event, but please, if you are willing or want to, go and have a bit of a social hour. And I think that's all for today. We'll see you guys next week. Thanks for coming, and thanks again to Professor Steel.